Let me now introduce a great friend, a tremendous federal leader, Dr. Nora Volkow. She has been the director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse since 2003. Dr. Volkow's work has been instrumental in demonstrating that drug addiction is a disease of the human brain. As a research psychiatrist and scientist, Dr. Volkow pioneered the use of brain imaging to investigate the toxic effects of drugs and their addictive properties. As many of you know, NIDA supports most of the world's research on the health aspects of drug abuse and addiction. It is because of NIDA and Dr. Volkow's work that we now have a greater understanding of how drug addiction impacts the brain, the harmful effects of drugs, and what drugs our young people are abusing. In addition, NIDA is a longtime supporter of CATCA and our community-based work. They have provided us the resources over the years and partnered with us to provide you with the latest information in ensuring that you fully understand and have the science necessary to do your work. They have sponsored many of our practical theories, our courses, and we have a new project that Dr. Volkow will talk about that we just entered into to ensure that you continue to have the latest information. Please help me welcome a world-renowned scientist, the great leader of NIDA, Dr. Nora Volkow.
Pleasure to be here, and I want to thank Dr. General Dean for having me the opportunity to come and speak with you. I think that these are extremely important times because we're faced with, I think, one of the greatest challenges we've observed in terms of the pattern of drug use in our country. There have been, of course, situations where drugs that were illegal were made legal for alcohol, but that was after a period where they had been legal, they made illegal, and then they go back to being legal. This is the first time in a long, long time where we have a drug that has been consistently being illegal, is now made legal in several states, whether it's recreational or medical marijuana, which poses the urgency to try to understand what are going to be the consequences of that change in policy as it relates to exposures to marijuana and negative effects. So my talk today is going to be specifically concentrated on that issue because it's one of tremendous urgency and one where you all can have the greatest impact in order to minimize potentially very negative effects. We know that marijuana is the most frequently used illicit drug in our country, and it is estimated that approximately 111 million people in the United States have been exposed to marijuana. On top of that, the recruitment of new users is actually quite high. And as you see, 2.4 million Americans are new users of marijuana on a given year. Now, as we broaden the access of marijuana, these numbers are likely to increase. And we know that to be the case because if you look at the prevalence rates of drugs across the United States or the world, those drugs that are more frequently used are the ones that are legal. And that is not because they are the most pleasurable or the best drugs. They are the most frequently used because of their legal status. And that has a profound effect on the willingness of some individuals to engage in behaviors that otherwise they wouldn't do because of the illegal nature of the drug. Who's being exposed to marijuana and what is the landscape in the United States? Well, marijuana, like all of the other drugs, is more frequently utilized when individuals are young, and most of the experimentation occurs during the teenage years, and the higher rates of use we observe in individuals that are in their 20s. And so it's the same situation for marijuana. Another aspect that is very relevant is that as we start to look at the nature of the course of addiction, we've come to realize that the younger you start taking drugs, including marijuana, the greater the likelihood that you are going to become addicted. And indeed, the risk of addiction is greatest during your late teens or early 20s. And I highlight this because it emphasizes one of the most important precepts of prevention. Prevention has to be very, very urgently targeted towards young people. Not that it's the only one, but it's an indispensable component. Now, how bad is the problem that we have in marijuana in our country? And I would say that the problem is, in terms of prevalence, is quite serious. And this data, which comes from Monitoring the Future, contrasts two measures in 12th graders between their past month of tobacco versus their past month of marijuana. And what you see is exactly what we are facing, a significant increase in marijuana use among young population that is epitomized in the contrast, our very good job vis-a-vis decreasing smoking among young people, so that for the past 3 years, the rate of past month marijuana smoking is higher than that of tobacco. And that is not, I mean, we have never seen that statistic before, where we have more kids in 12th grade abusing on a monthly basis marijuana than tobacco. Now, this indicator is worrisome in itself, but another even more worrisome indicator comes from a question from also the Monitoring the Future that aims to actually measure the number of kids that use marijuana regularly. And regularly means basically every single day. And this is an important indicator because it is likely that regular use is the one that's most harmful. And in the United States, in 2013, 6.5% of 12th graders said they use marijuana regularly. 6.5, and that's in school, which means that it's actually an underestimation, because if you're a regular marijuana user, consistently, studies have shown you are much more likely to drop out of school. And this again highlights an indicator in my brain that we have a serious problem of abuse of marijuana among adolescents that we need to actually counteract. Well, what does marijuana do? Marijuana, as you know, some pretend that there's a controversy of whether marijuana is addictive or not. There's no controversy. Marijuana produces addiction. And in fact, the mechanisms by which it triggers the process of addiction in the brain are not different from that of other drugs. All of the drugs that produce addiction have a common effect. They increase dopamine in the nucleus accumbens. And the nucleus accumbens is the main reward center in the brain. And its activation by dopamine triggers a series of adaptations that in some individuals will result in drug addiction. Now, how drugs increase dopamine in the brain vary depending on the type of drug. So cocaine increases dopamine by a different mechanism than marijuana or alcohol. In the case of marijuana, marijuana increases dopamine by activating what we call cannabinoid receptors, because cannabinoids, marijuana is a cannabinoid. So marijuana stimulates those cannabinoid receptors, and in the reward system leads to increases in dopamine that are perceived as very pleasurable. Now, it so happens that these cannabinoid receptors are not in our brain. Actually, by the way, they're one of the most frequent receptors that we have with the highest concentrations in the brain, the cannabinoid receptors. And they are not there for us to take marijuana. They are there because they play an extraordinarily important role in regulating function in multiple areas of the brain, including regulating brain development. And the next slide shows the areas where you have very, very high concentration of these cannabinoid receptors, which actually are involved in multiple processes, such as cognition, such as alertness, such as reward, such as memory, such as motor coordination. So therefore, it is not surprising that when someone is intoxicated with marijuana, whether people want to deny it or not, the evidence is out there. You're actually much less able to learn or memorize. You're much less able to have proper motor coordination. You're much less able to pay attention. And this in turn, of course, if you're a young person trying to learn, is going to interfere with your capacity to memorize and to attain the subsequent educational level. Not to say that this explains why, when someone is intoxicated with marijuana, they're at much greater risk of having a car accident, and if they have a car accident, much greater risk that it is fatal than when they are not intoxicated with marijuana. Now, how addictive is marijuana? And that's an argument that people basically state. We know that not everybody that gets exposed to drugs will become addicted. And some drugs are more addictive than others because of the chemical characteristics of the drug. For example, methamphetamine is the most potent of them in increasing dopamine. Other drugs may generate a higher likelihood of addiction because they basically are widely available, so it's easier to repeat the consumption, which is, of course, a variable that's necessary in order to become addicted. Marijuana, it's estimated that approximately 9% of individuals that get exposed to marijuana will become addicted. And that, in turn, will actually, if you are, by the way, if you are younger than 17 years of age, that risk goes from 9% to 16%. Now, another important question that has come around, and the slides actually have been moved before what I want, is the concept that we've all discussed, marijuana as a gateway drug. And that is, indeed, if you look at the epidemiological data, has shown that people that become addicted to a wide variety of drugs, in many instances, start by taking marijuana. And this led to the concept of the gateway drug. Now, is this, do we have evidence or not? Well, what we do know is that the younger you start taking marijuana, even after you control for your genetics, as is shown by this study, which was done in twins, those twins that started smoking marijuana before age 17 had a much greater risk not just to becoming addicted to marijuana, because the other twin eventually did start taking to marijuana. They were recruited to be discordant, not in marijuana addiction, but at the age of initiation. And those that started before age 17 have a much greater risk of becoming addicted to a wide variety of drugs, indicating from epidemiological data and animal studies that indeed early exposure to marijuana may be associated with a greater risk to become addicted to other drugs. Now, a question that a lot of people are asking, does marijuana harm the brain? And I'm going to give you objective evidence and not subjectivity. No, I smoke marijuana and nothing happened to me. This is objective evidence that uses actually brain imaging technologies to try to document how does the regular use of marijuana influence your brain. Well, what about cannabinoid receptors? Cannabinoid receptors, as I say, are crucial for processing information in multiple areas of the brain. You need the system in order for your brain to function properly. And this is a brain imaging study that shows that particularly across all of the cortical areas of the brain, which is the area of the brain that allows you to think, there is a significant reduction in cannabinoid receptors in marijuana smokers. So the main target of marijuana decreases with repeated use, which is likely to account, of course, from some of the long-lasting changes that are observed in marijuana abusers. If you look at the morphology, the structure of the brain, which is actually a very non-sensitive indicator, but even with that non-sensitive indicator, because you need a lot of exposure to see changes, marijuana abusers show decreases in volume in limbic areas of the brain, such as the hippocampus and the amygdala. They are smaller. And the hippocampus is an area that is extremely important for us to be able to memorize and learn. It's indispensable. And the amygdala, on the other hand, is a crucial area that is implicated in emotions and responsible, for example, for enhanced anxiety, in fact, when that cannabinoid system does not work. So what you are observing is that areas of the brain involved with memory and emotion are actually significantly disrupted in chronic marijuana users, and these are adults. Now, this is a study that actually not looks at volumes, but looks at how the brain is connected. The brain is a series of networks of areas communicating with one another. And those connections are crucial for proper function of the brain. And what this study did, and I think it's one of the most powerful studies I've seen in brain imaging, they took individuals that had smoked marijuana before age 18, and they measured their connectivity. And that they showed that the connections, the wiring of the brain in very specific areas was profoundly decreased. And what does it mean profoundly decreased? That the number of fibers was reduced by 90 to 85%. What areas are those? Hippocampus, one of the connections of the hippocampus, which of course could then help us understand why they cannot memorize. But another one there, the one on the top, is actually one that was surprising. It's a connection of the main pathway that connects left and right parts of your brain with the main node in the human brain, what we call the precuneus. And that is profoundly disrupted in marijuana abusers. And the longer the exposure, the less the fibers in those pathways. Now I have the time here in my brain. Cool. These structural changes, particularly the ones that I've just shown you in terms of the connectivity, what are the consequences? Well, one of the consequences may be what this really elegant study showed. This is a study that differs from other studies that had shown that there is cognitive impairment in adolescents that take marijuana. And this study went one step further because in the past, though the previous studies had been criticized by the concept of saying, yes, adult kids that are smoking marijuana have lower cognitive abilities, but it could be that they started to take marijuana because they had, in order to try to compensate for these cognitive deficits. This particular study is prospective and accounts for cognitive performance of kids at age 13 before they start taking marijuana, and it follows them until they are age 32. And it compares them against individuals that have taken marijuana but did not start before age 18. And what this study shows is that those individuals that started smoking marijuana before age 18 showed a decrease in IQ points up to 8, a decrease in 8 points of intelligence quotient, which can make the difference between succeeding in educational achievement or not. And this is accounted for by premorbid function, clearly indicating that smoking marijuana for our adolescents is not a good. If we want to have a nation of stoned teenagers that are actually unable to outperform our competitors, then if we don't want to have that, then we really need to be very aggressive in the prevention campaigns. Now, one of the arguments that is made is that says, well, maybe I'm smoking marijuana because I don't want to be in this rat race of achievement, blah, 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 okay? So the investigators have gone back in those individuals that are very cool and they're smoking, blah, blah, blah. And they ask them subjective and they measure objective indicators of success as adults, after accounting for their parental socioeconomic status. And what they found, and this has again been consistently shown, is that those individuals who had been smoking continuously marijuana were much less satisfied with their lives by their subjective descriptors, but also by objective descriptors in terms of had they been able to achieve the educational status, how much they were making, professional. They were actually performing much worse than those individuals that had never smoked marijuana or have just experimented on occasional instances, clearly indicating that, yes, whether we like it or not, chronic exposure to marijuana is not good to your brain, and chronic exposure of marijuana is not good to your life, whether we like it or not. Now, all of these studies that I've been showing you, showing these deficits, actually have an unknown that is likely to indicate that the effects are probably worse than we currently have. And that's because the amount of the active ingredient of marijuana has been increasing significantly since in the past 15 years. And here you have the content of 9-THC, which is the active ingredient of marijuana. And you can see almost a doubling in the past 10 years on the content of 9-THC. So at the beginning of when they were starting to look at the content, and I think I cannot see it exactly when it was 4%, now it's 12%, threefold higher. So the marijuana that we have is much more potent. And again, people say, blah, blah, blah. You regulate how much you smoke, it doesn't really make a difference. Well, that's not exactly what the data is showing. And this is a study from Norway where they've been actually monitoring the content of marijuana in individuals that are driving and are stopped by the police. And what you can see is the significant increase in the plasma concentration of THC across time, which is likely to reflect the fact that the more potent marijuana is indeed resulting in much higher concentrations of THC in the plasma and likely to have a much more addictive component, but also explain these numbers, the significant increases that we are observing, not just on treatment admissions for marijuana addiction, but in emergency rooms, even though in those years that you see there, the increase in marijuana have not started to emerge in the United States. But what had started to emerge was that content of the marijuana was much more potent. So where are we? And I come back to my first point, and to a point that I was thanking General Dean for having invited me. We don't have any treatment currently for marijuana addiction. We're working with researchers to have it. And it's a very difficult addiction to treat. But what we do have is prevention interventions that work. And we also know that the single most powerful thing that we can do to actually minimize the adverse effects of drugs in our country, the single most, by far, is prevention. And prevention in young people works. And in fact, the data here shows it. It's a very simple graph that contrasts the prevalence of kids that are smoking marijuana versus the prevalence of kids that perceive marijuana as risky. And what you can clearly see in blue, as less kids perceive marijuana as risky, you have a higher number of kids that are going to be smoking marijuana. As we face a country that is sending these double messages about whether marijuana is harmful or not, where millions of dollars are being spent in order to change a culture that will lead to the belief that marijuana is not harmful, we have to understand that we need to provide evidence that is objective and not stopping doing so, such that kids, in particularly kids, are able to recognize the adverse effect of smoking marijuana and prevent them from going into an addiction and also, at the end, interfering with the likelihood of succeeding in their lives, as has been shown already for multiple studies. I want to end my presentation just with an advertisement. We just recently released our treatment program for adolescents, and we're also partnering with CATCA to generate a program that will facilitate the education on the basis of the science evidence so that you who are out there in the trenches can provide information that is objective, that can help kids take the right decision and avoid smoking marijuana, either because of peer pressure or because of the belief that it is a benign drug. Thanks very much for your attention.
Great job. Well done. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Look at this. About 3 questions we have to go, right?
Yes.
Okay. What a great presentation. So timely. Thank you very much, Dr. Volkow. Dr. Volkow had to rearrange her schedule. She is hosting her national council, but she rearranged her schedule just to come to be with you and to present this very compelling information that we so desperately needed. But, so about 3 of you are going to be very fortunate. Unfortunately, many of you will not be as fortunate. So I'm gonna recognize about 3 questions, and then we're gonna let her go back to her office because she really has to get back to work. So we have some mics, and if you have a burning question that you think is of importance to the rest of the audience, we're gonna give about 3 people a chance to do that. Mel, first question back there.
Deborah Williams, Anchorage Youth Development Coalition. As you may know, we are facing a marijuana legalization initiative in our August ballot. Quick question, will you please come to Alaska and present that presentation?
Sorry about that.
When is this? No, I mean, I think it is important because people are voting without the knowledge, and we have to counter investments. Of individuals wanting to change the culture and believing it's a safe drug. So if you can contact my office and you tell me what is the timeline, I definitively can look at it, and if I can do it, I'll do it. If I cannot do it, I won't.
Okay, Carlton, over here, please.
Hi, good morning. My name is Deb Whitkus. I'm from Vermont with Greater Falls Connections. And I just wanted to know, we've been working a lot, having wonderful conversations with youth about the dangers of marijuana using the science. Thank you so much for your work. I'm just wondering, in terms of the amygdala and the hippocampus, when you talk about IQ, I wonder about, in terms of the emotional and social development, do you have any research going on in terms of that, like what effect it might have on mirror neurons and stuff like that? Because I think the kids would really respond to knowing that, you know, if it's complicating their ability to maintain and sustain friendships.
Yeah, that's a very good question. And when you, I mean, I'm a physician, and when you, I mean, one of the things that they taught us was that repeated marijuana leads to what is called an amotivational syndrome, which results in the lack of interest for everyday activity, including spending time with friends. And this is much harder to actually measure than if you can subtract or add 5 or 6 numbers. How do you measure emotions? And the studies that have done it have shown, for example, that indeed those that have been exposed to marijuana are much less likely to be involved in their job activities. To my knowledge, no one has done that study in an objective way among students. There are anecdotes that professors have reported, but objectively, these have not been measured. I would predict, based on the clinical presentation of this amotivational syndrome, that what you will see is that the sensitivity of kids that are exposed to marijuana to rewards, their excitement about things that normally motivate us would be decreased. But again, this is something for which, unfortunately, we do not have sufficient evidence. The abnormalities that we're seeing in the amygdala are likely to translate in less reactivity to certain emotions. And also what we do know is that those individuals that get exposed to marijuana, when they are not intoxicated with the drug, then they become much more vulnerable to anxiety and stress reactivity. So they're much more stress prone. And they then get into this feedback of smoking marijuana to try to compensate that high levels of anxiety.
Okay. Over here on the left.
Hi, Nora. John Hamilton from Connecticut Clinical Trials Network. General question, why isn't there more prevention studies in the Clinical Trials Network that could be used as a vehicle to actually study some prevention? And a specific question is, I didn't see any slides up there in any correlation between co-occurring mental health disorders and marijuana use. Is that being looked at? Because that needs to be like a red flag, as I see it, for what puts kids at risk for self-medication.
Yeah, no, and absolutely, and that's an extraordinarily important point. Now that we're seeing the access to marijuana and the culture changing, those with mental illness are going to likely be going to be more vulnerable to consume marijuana. We already see very high rates of abuse of marijuana among kids that have a comorbid mental disease. That's likely to increase, and certainly there has been an enormous amount of interest both in the United States and in Europe about the association between marijuana and psychosis including schizophrenia, as well as the use of marijuana increasing the vulnerability for depression or anxiety disorders. The extent to which there is a causal relationship, both for depression and anxiety, is unclear. With respect to schizophrenia, what is appearing to emerge is that those individuals that have a genetic vulnerability and smoke marijuana, in them, marijuana may trigger the schizophrenia that otherwise may have not emerged. So yes, we're funding researchers in that whole area of research. If I didn't present this, I had 20 minutes. As for the notion of prevention in the clinical trial network, in the clinical trial network, we're predominantly developing strategies for treatment. But there is one that is very relevant for prevention. We're trying to engage the healthcare system in the screening and brief intervention, both in adolescents and adults, to try to prevent the escalation of occasional marijuana use into addiction.
Thank you.
2 points. Those of you that continue to have questions, you can drop them off at our information booth or downstairs at the category exhibit booth. We will get them to NIDA, and hopefully we will be able to get you an answer. But for the last question, we have a Twitter question that came in, and you can read that right there. Want me to read it out?
What are the effects of marijuana use during pregnancy with infants in the long term and treatments currently being utilized? I mean, this is another slide that I couldn't show, or the subject matter, because of the 20 minutes limit. But there is, we found research. This is an extremely important one, and one that we have not really brought up attention as the marijuana becomes more medically legal or recreational legal. You're going to see an increase in the number of pregnant women smoking marijuana and fetuses being intoxicated with marijuana, because marijuana crosses the placenta, it crosses the blood-brain barrier, and is delivered into the brain of the fetus. And from animal studies, for example, it has been shown, indeed, that it interferes with gene expression in the brain in such a way that it's going to jeopardizing the way that neurons form contacts with one another. Neurons have these processes that are very complex that allow them to touch different areas. And as I spoke to you, the brain is a very complex network. And in animals as well, and in fetuses that have been exposed to marijuana, researchers have now, for example, clearly documented that those connections are significantly disrupted in those fetuses that were exposed to marijuana. So to start with, that may be one of the most vulnerable periods for the negative effects of marijuana on brain development, that fetal. So we speak a lot about children and adolescents because the brain is growing very, very rapidly. Well, so is the case during fetal development, and cannabinoids express themselves very early on. So when you massively stimulate them because someone is smoking marijuana, you're going to interfere with this very carefully orchestrated process that results on what you want to be the most extraordinary organ that we have, the human brain.
Okay. Thank you so very much. Thank you so
Thanks.
much. Thank you so much. Okay. Thanks again, Dr. Volkow. Thank you so very much. Thank you.